Jian DeLeon, and this is K11 Konversations, a podcast where we discuss the intersection between creativity, culture, and innovation in line with K11's social mission to incubate talent and propagate culture. On today's episode, I'm speaking with Richard Kim of Galaxy Interactive. Their mission is to invest in content and technology that foster meaningful connection, engagement, and opportunity in the digital realm. Richard's Art Blocks NFT collection will be on view during Hong Kong's most ambitious NFT showcase, MetaVision at K11 MUSEA. His collection focuses on generative art, in which the work has been created with the use of an autonomous system. Richard and I will talk about the basics of what generative art is, how to filter out the noise in the marketplace, and how to create your own sense of community within the space. Here's Richard. Richard, thanks so much for taking some time to join me. I understand from your Substack post, Meandering Musings, that you're a relatively new collector in the NFT space. So let's just go ahead and start with that. We'll include a link to your post in the show notes. Tell me a little bit about yourself before getting sucked into the NFT K-hole.
Yeah. So my background is a combination of markets and law. I was the COO of FX and emerging markets trading at Goldman and JP for 6 years. And prior to that, I have a legal background in derivatives regulation and corporate insolvency and this sort of thing. So I had a very kind of standard, I'd say, institutional background in zero-sum markets. And, I first started getting in the crypto space in 2018 when I joined Galaxy Digital, originally as the COO before moving over to co-manage the venture franchise with my current partner, Sam, at Galaxy Interactive. We, as part of our mandate, look at what happens when our relationships, our identity, our wealth really is accumulated in primarily digital and virtual worlds, where most of our connections are not in physical person, but actually online. I think we're in the middle of a kind of generational shift in the meaning and source of value across the globe. And it's a really interesting trend because it's one that transcends borders and relates much more to communities and the passions with which they organize than traditional boundaries. So with that lens, that's how I started approaching art and the collecting of digital art. I wouldn't call myself new to NFTs. I mean, I started collecting NFTs in 2017. So I was pretty early in the space, but I didn't really start getting into them until 2020 when I discovered generative art and what happens when you mix these incredibly powerful primitives in terms of fine art and the communities that organize around them together with a digitally native medium where you have this idea of code as art. And what it was always missing was a primitive for digital scarcity so that the art itself could not be infinitely replicable, but was scarce through a digital signature.
And I do want to get into that, right? Because what I meant was in your post, you talk about not necessarily considering yourself an art collector. And then when I listened to you in podcast, you speak about community. And one of the things that I was drawn towards was you drew a parallel between this collector mindset, so to speak, which I want to ask about, specifically the behaviors and the motivations that traditional art collectors, traditional in quotes, and what's been carried over into digital art, that sort of same kind of drive to accumulate.
I came at the generative art space without much of a fine arts background. I'd always appreciated going to galleries, but never collected meaningful work myself personally. And I've been able to develop a view on that space from the outside looking in, but I think it's precisely because I'm not an insider in that space that I was able to look at something like generative art on a first principles basis. One thing I've found is those who are used to the traditional art space try to bucket things like NFTs and generative art into traditional heuristics, but it's actually best placed looked at de novo, where you have this primitive that, like I was saying, provides for the first time digital scarcity in the context of a previously infinitely replicable creative work. And you combine that with the unique power of communities and cults that have developed around collecting particular things, together with a Robin Hood style speculation game and the kind of lottery effect or gotcha effect of pulling a pack of cards and hoping you get something rare. So how do you fit all of these motivating influences into a single bucket and just compare that as if it were apples to something like modern art? I don't think you can do that, right? And I think you run the risk of kind of tainting what it really is. And in our space more broadly, gaming, interactive entertainment, digital art, I think so much of understanding what's happening here is not about predicting the future, but about taking off existing blindfolds and biases that color our perceptions of what's happening.
Now, speaking of that, let's talk specifically about generative art and then going into art blocks. How do you define generative art as it applies to NFTs and the type of works that you've tended to collect since 2020?
I think of generative art as like procedural art, which has existed for decades. It's essentially this process where the artist sets into motion some procedure or process that in turn kind of recreates the artistic vision, right? And I think what has made generative art really interesting in the NFT context is it's been mixed with this primitive of controlled randomness where you don't get the same output every time you run the algo, but it kind of produces an unexpected result when combined with randomness, right? And so Art Blocks is this platform for the creation of generative art and a community and commerce engine surrounding that core idea where artists can upload their algorithmic scripts that can create outputs of art that are deterministic from the algo, but deterministic when combined with a random seed of potentially infinite variation, meaning there's a potentially infinite number of outputs from the algorithm, right? How it typically works is you as a consumer can mint from the algorithm or create a piece from the algorithm by paying a certain amount of the native currency, usually Ether in this context, and receiving a unique one of one digital work from the algorithm up to some limit. You know, usually they're somewhere between 200 and 1,000 outputs that can be minted. And once that's done, that is the work that the artist has essentially signed, right? So what's interesting about it is to kind of ponder the what could have been outputs. You know, often it's very fun to look at an algorithm that's well known and look at the test outputs, right? Because in some sense they're very real, but they're not in the sense that they're not considered part of the artist's official canon of work because the signature is not attached to it, right? So it's this pretty interesting idea where for the first time, you can bring digital scarcity to an algorithm that previously could have been run an infinite number of times, right?
In your article, you also talk about how you could never see yourself buying like a crypto punk, and you specifically called out like ape culture, which have their procedural generation for their version of NFTs, which results in like rare traits. Very akin to like trading card culture, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have a fine artist, someone established in that world like Daniel Arsham, with his own version of generative works that tie back to his physical canon, wherein you have these sort of living sculptures that kind of erode over time. And so, how do you sort of define the difference between all these kinds of different generative arts?
I think those well placed in art history can probably technically define it better. For me, the difference is one that's kind of emotional and related to discovery, right? When you buy into a profile pic project, yes, you're getting some random output. So in some sense, these are generative projects, but is it art? And obviously that's a very subjective question. To me, the reason I don't like these projects is a lot of the individual discovery of one's taste has gone away. I think what I've enjoyed most about collecting digital art is I've done so largely without regard to expert opinion. And the issue with a lot of these profile pic projects, at least the more mainstream ones like Bored Apes now, is the cost of entry is so prohibitively high that really what you're doing is buying into a cult. And I'm not saying that in a negative way, right? Like there's a certain mystique and aura that have developed around these profile pic projects in terms of what community means, what the roadmap for these projects is, that it almost feels a bit commercial, the transaction. And I contrast that to art, which to me will always be an individualistic thing. During the kind of peak bubble, I think the prices of art blocks had gotten so high that it was starting to suffer from some of these same dynamics of expert opinion and influencers and things like this. So whenever I tell people to start collecting generative art, I usually don't direct them to Ethereum and the platforms that have spawned on it, like Art Blocks, which was very pioneering in the space, but usually to a lower cost of entry platform like FX Hash on Tezos, precisely because it's cheaper. I was fortunate enough to get into art blocks at a time when the cost of entry was extremely manageable. And we're once again entering one of those periods. It's safe again to start collecting on a lot of these platforms like art blocks, but for a moment in time, it wasn't. It would cost $10,000 to $20,000 to buy your first piece, which is clearly a barrier to mainstream adoption. So I think that process of forget about what the experts say, go figure out what you like, and then kind of hone and refine your taste over time. I think it's one of the most democratizing and powerful aspects of this medium that really shouldn't be diminished.
I do want to come back to that democratization aspect, but first I want to ask about Fidenza 553 by Tyler Hobbs. Was that one of the first big purchases that you remember making on art blocks?
It was my biggest for a while, for sure. I think I bought that around 22, 25 Ether at the time, which I had just bought a Tesla. And I was thinking, wow, this costs the same amount as my Tesla. Am I insane?
And for people who don't know what it looks like, it's a grayscale, kind of like a Jasper Johns. It's very abstract. It's a complete antithesis from, a punk or an ape with its bright colors and neons. And it's very minimal and tasteful in the way that it's executed. So what attracted you to that piece? How did you discover the work?
Well, Fidenza is essentially this work by Tyler Hobbs with around 1,000 outputs. And it centers on this concept of flow field, which is not new in generative art. But I think the particular take on flow field algorithms here was really interesting because of the diversity of output. Somehow, every Fidenza was still unified. Like if you look at all of 1,000 outputs, you'll instantly be able to tell that they're Fidenzas. So it has that uniquely unifying characteristic, and yet there's such diversity of output amongst the Fidenzas that you're kind of surprised that intuitively these are all part of the same set at the same time.
And they're all based on like the structured curved and block shapes that are part of that particular series.
Yeah. This was one where I had minted a piece and I liked it, but I wasn't blown away by it. And this was the peak of the art blocks bear market. The pattern had been whenever these things mint out on primary sales, you would have some hype on day one of everyone who loved it. But then eventually over time, as interest in the set waned, the price would trade down. So Fidenzas was one in the heart of the bear market where I liked a lot of the outputs I was seeing, but I decided I was going to wait a couple of days to pick up some more. And it never went down. It just kept going up in a very steady way to the point where I decided I had to buy into the quote bubble and pick up a couple more at 1 to 3 ETH each. The idea of buying a secondary piece above 1 Ether at the time was really like, wow, that's kind of expensive. And the idea of buying something for 3 ETH was kind of crazy at the time. And the idea of buying something for 23 ETH was just, what is that, right? Like, why would you do that? So the particular piece here was one of 5 dark lifestyle pieces. So the color trade was very dark. Amongst them, this is one of, I believe, 3 soft shapes in the dark lifestyle. So if you really zoom into this, the shapes are very soft. They look like scarves. And so to me, it was one of the undoubted best pieces in the set. I felt like I just had to have it. It's something that I think a lot of collectors go through. As silly as it sounds, they start losing sleep because they can't imagine a life without this piece they really, really want. And to go through those emotive highs and lows, I think is a really interesting thing. I no longer have the piece.
Well, that was my next question, right? It's like, of the many words in the lexicon of crypto and NFT culture, like hodl gang, right? People who hold on to pieces. My understanding from reading your article is that this was one of the works that sort of helped you rip that Band-Aid off and look at a deeper way of collecting and turning one piece into other pieces.
Yeah. The other stigma that's developed in NFT space is this idea of flipping. It's funny because so much of the platform growth and community excitement and new user accumulation is driven by the prospect of profit. So it's not one of these things where you can just say never trade. Certainly some artists like Dmitry Cherniak has gone out of his way with the Raptures, for example, to encourage people not to trade by setting up a game theory of what happens if you do. But in general, like the secondary sales are good, liquidity is good up to a point, right? And it's a very fine balance. Like, in fact, I recently sold some Subscapes by Matt Delorier, who's one of my favorite artists. And I got some extremely negative reactions in the Artblocks Discord. This was a couple months ago about how, I had posted how much I love Subscapes. I had 13 of them at the time. And the fact that I was selling a couple, this made me a disingenuous bad actor. How could he be saying, he loves this set and be selling it at the same time? I think collectors' tastes mature and evolve over time. And, you often go through these spurts where you collect everything and then you refine your taste on what you like and what you don't. And through some of these sales, you can buy other art that you really like, right? And so I'm one of these people who doesn't believe speculation is inherently bad thing in the NFT context up to a point. As long as the overall discussion is about the art and there's no expectation of short-term kind of flipping or liquidity. And there are certainly people who play that game, and I don't think they're terrible people. Some people hate them. But
Right.
I think the better approach is to design your economic systems in a way that encourages long-term holding rather than kind of short-term speculative fervor.
One thing I also want to ask about, right, is right from the beginning of your piece, you specifically talk about, and I think I love this, how the community of early adopters of ape, etc. It's almost like the people who own the art have superseded the artists in terms of who has the loudest voice, right? And you mentioned you own a Tesla, and I just remember the analogy in my head. It's like, in some ways, the NFT community is like that early adopter electric car community, where the ownership and like the people who are bullish on it can't stop talking about how they own this product and how they're a part of this and how that's sort of dominated the conversation.
It's a fine balance, right? Because every artist wants a collector community talking about the art and encouraging others to come in. And that's one of the beauties and beautiful primitives of Web3 is it turns your users into owners, right? But that also can be taken to an extreme where effectively you have these cult-like movements that don't care about underlying fundamentals or having a substantive discussion about what they're peddling, but just care about their book. So that's a fine tension that exists in crypto and, needs to be resolved for any community, including art, right? Because I think art
Right.
blocks also went through a period like that where because so many people got excited and so many people effectively bought the top, what do you do when your new members have bought something that's down 80%, right? You can talk about community all you want, but no one likes going to the casino and losing 80% of what they walked in with. So
Mhm.
it's a double-edged sword and tension that exists in Web3.
Well, tell me about, the one rule that you had tweeted earlier this month where you're talking about follow the artists wherever they are, and the only thing you should be maxi on is creativity and talent.
I'm much more progressive on the which chain question than most collectors. I know a lot of people who are either Ethereum maximalists or Tezos maximalists. Those are the two big chains, at least in our space, generative art. Yeah, I love both. I continue to collect on both. I continue to be a big supporter of art blocks, but I think it's instructive to look at what's happening at FX Hash because it's a very different way of developing a platform, right? Art blocks is this highly curated, application driven process that is focused on bringing the best generative artists to the ecosystem and putting a lot of development efforts around that in a maximally on-chain way, right? And there's no one who's been more thoughtful about this than Eric, who founded
Mhm.
Artblocks. At the same time, the cost of entry continues to be very high. It's come down a lot. It's come down in some cases 90%, but it's still high for a lot of people. So that's where having more of a sandbox like Tezos is great, not just for the collectors, but for the artists as well, because I think some of the biggest talent are going to be those 13-year-old coders who are just playing with
Mhm.
processing as a primitive and produce unbelievable works of creativity right out of nowhere. And these are people who would not be accepted through a typical curated funnel, but on FX Hash, they don't need any permission to go and upload their script and have the whole world interact with it.
Mm.
And that's been one of my favorite parts of FX Hash is discovering completely new artists and essentially being able to talk about their work in the community and elevate them. It's always funny seeing the reactions like, oh my God, I can't believe my work just sold for $50. Something that like
Right.
is less than the cost of gas on ETH.
Well, speaking of discovering new artists and showcasing them on platforms, tell us about the pieces that you'll be bringing and showing at K11 MUSEA. What are some of the standouts to you?
It's a good combination of some of the really well-known art blocks artists. Like Dmitry Cherniak is someone who I think is a real pioneer in the space. His most well-known set is ringers, which is this idea of how many ways can you wrap a string around pegs. What I love about the set is through these simple shapes, you can see a lot of human traits in some of
Hmm.
these things. And that idea of controlled randomness producing something that appears human, even though it's obviously just a product of chance, I think it's wonderful. One of the pieces is Ringer's 911, which is nicknamed the ambulance. And it looks like the flashing lights of an ambulance. And what are the odds that Mint 911 is one of the rare reds? It looks like an ambulance. I don't know. I mean, pretty special piece. And so it's not just purely a rarity game with these things, but how much they resemble something, right? Like one of the pieces that sold for the most was called the goose. And it looks like a goose, right? It's not even particularly rare. It's just, it looks like a goose. And so yeah, I love that sort of stuff. Fidenzas that we already spoke about that. Aside from the art blocks pieces, there's a French generative artist called Zancan, who's probably my current favorite artist. He's released the most popular set on FX Hash called Gardens and Monoliths. And, he's a really singular style that mixes a number of different influences that I can't really put in any one bucket, but a Zancan when you see it. He's an oil painter by background, but is also just one of the top creative coders. When I show his work to some of my mathematician friends who understand generative art quite well, they look at it and they're like, I don't understand how he created this with code. There's a lot of technical skill there in addition just to the beauty. And I think Zancan, because he's primarily been releasing work on Tezos, he continues to be one of the most underrated artists of our generation.
What other advice would you have for how to best filter out the noise that the marketplace has these days?
I think it depends on what your objective is, right? If your objective is just to develop a taste for digital native art and feel what it's like to be a collector in a community, go get started and assume that you won't be able to sell anything. Often people come for the market and stay for the art, and that's great. And I was able to do that. But you don't have to come for the market at all. You could just come for the art and never flip any of these pieces, right? And I think that's sometimes much better because it's invariant to market conditions. Who cares what the secondary price is of something if you're never going to sell it?
It's so interesting to me, right? Because I come from a fashion background. So when it comes to personal style and also personal taste, I think there's some parallels there in terms of how do you fine tune what works for you and what you like, and how do you learn to trust your own sense of self. And so what sort of tips did you have coming into your own and developing your own aesthetic and learning to trust your own taste rather than waiting for some kind of external validation or waiting for the community to be like, well, this is the sort of groupthink that we want to gravitate towards?
I went from looking for things that looked good or what I would think others think look good to more just things now that I collect are things I've never seen before in terms of style. That's much more appealing to me. And things that just resonate with me culturally. The type of art that I used to collect a lot of, they look good in generative form, but they're kind of boring. This is the type of generative art I don't really like these days. And so I'm much more about, does this reflect a part of nature that I feel corresponds to the real world in some way, or teaches me something about what it means to be alive, that kind of unexpected wonder that taps into this controlled randomness primitive and makes me think, I didn't really think about things that way, right? And I think the power of code to do that is really immense. Ultimately, the generative art that sticks out is going to be the ones that don't feel like purely mechanistic, purely the result of brutalist code, but the type of work that makes us feel more alive and connected to our physical realities.
So did putting those guardrails on, did that make you less susceptible to FOMO in the market? Or is that something that you still find yourself still swept up in the hype of any particular release?
I almost never participate in primary sales anymore, which has been great psychologically, because if you're not minting, then you don't have to do all the pre-output analysis of, is this going to be a good investment? Am I buying in too early? I can just look at the art and be like, okay, yes, the market has already 10x this, but it's okay because I like it. Or conversely, no, I think the market's 10x this and I think it's too much, but it's based on the actual art, right? So it's much more psychologically comforting to not have to try to anticipate the next huge thing. That's a pretty all-consuming game.
Yeah. Wrapping up here, one of the things I also wanted to ask about was scams and getting hacked. You got hacked. Your MetaMask was hacked on January 5. And so what are some ways that people can be more vigilant about personal security, but also what are some ground rules for what can pass? What are some obvious red flags for any sort of project? And how can people more carefully navigate, this emerging space where, frankly, some people want to take advantage of the fact that there's so many newcomers coming in and wanting to get involved?
I think the classic advice is, if you're really actively involved in minting, interacting with new smart contracts, do that from a hot wallet and transfer the pieces you've bought to a vault wallet secured on hardware. Because the number one risk factor, it used to be hot wallet versus hardware wallet. And that's still critically important. Everyone should use a hardware wallet for their vaulted pieces. But the biggest risk factor right now is, and this is an issue with hardware wallets as well, is approving smart contract permissions that allow a contract to transfer out your pieces. So you have signing authority over broad collections, right? And that's a problem because a lot of people interacting with these contracts are just not technical enough to understand what they're giving permission for. Whereas if you do that on a hot wallet with nothing in it other than the funds you need to purchase, you're not going to lose anything because you transfer everything out to the vault wallet afterwards, right? That's a much better way of doing things if you really want to be secure.
Well, Richard, thank you so much for your time. Before I let you go, are there any other exciting projects coming out from Galaxy or any other works that you appreciate that should be on our radar?
I get the benefit in my day job as a fund manager in the interactive space to meet a lot of interesting projects. And to me, what's most interesting is the convergence from a financial standpoint of a lot of the markets infrastructure with things like NFTs and art and gaming marketplaces. Ultimately, these digital objects are going to carry a tremendous amount of status and value well above and beyond what they do in niche communities today and form a really core cohesive part of your consolidated Web 2, Web 3 identity. So I think that's a really interesting trend that's only going to accelerate in the coming years. And so the sooner you get involved with these digital native forms of value, I think the better place you'll be to survive in the brave new world.
Absolutely. Well, Richard, again, thank you so much for your time. This is a really fun conversation.
Cool.
K11 Conversations is produced by Sonia Manalili and hosted by me, Jian DeLeon. Stay tuned for more episodes.